Chapter 15. Adian. A Song in the Dark. Adian awoke to a searing pain in his back and head that was punctuated by rhythmic, jarring impacts. He moaned softly and slowly opened his eyes to see a dark, blurry world that bounced as his head lolled back and forth. His jumbled mind tried and failed to come up with an explanation for his current predicament, but the combination of his jerky motion and occasional patches of bright green light that pierced his mind like an icy knife made it nearly impossible to think. Time stretched on as both his mind and his vision began to slowly clear. Eventually, he regained enough wherewithal to attempt to lift and stabilize his head so that he could get a better idea of his surroundings. He immediately regretted the action as it caused a wave of fire to burn across his shoulders and upper back. He let out an involuntary scream of pain, which was followed immediately by a moment of weightlessness as whatever had previously been supporting him fell away. In the next moment, however, a pain more intense than he had ever felt before exploded from his back as his downward momentum was abruptly halted. He lost himself once again, but this time only for a moment, before his mind was pulled back from the brink of oblivion by a torrent of soft, panicked words. "I'm so sorry. Are you okay? I almost dropped you. After everything, I almost dropped you. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. Adian, can you hear me? I'm sorry. Are you okay? Adian, can you hear me? Are you okay?" Dre half sobbed, half whispered. Dre's unhinged response sent unease creeping its way to the forefront of Adian's mind. He had been desperately trying to remember what had happened, but maybe he didn't want to know. "Where are we? Where is everyone? The last thing I remember is running from the horde." He managed to croak out the words from his parched mouth. Dre's dour expression fell even further. He leaned against a rocky wall, and he cast his eyes away from Adian, whom he still held like a child in his arms. "We are still in the dungeon. That's all I know for sure." He looked up, slowly, with a pained, almost accusatory gaze. "Do you truly not remember? The fire? Marcia? The cat monster? Olive and Miena? The explosion? None of it?" The words lit a fire that burned away the clinging fog that had invaded his mind, and immediately Adian realized that his amnesia had been a blessing and not a curse, a mercy from the Creator that by its very nature could only be fleeting. He yearned for the return of it, for it was only then that the pain truly started. A mountain of grief slammed down on him. It felt as if it could squish him flat against the ground, but it didn't. Adian could feel tears running in anguished rivulets down his cheeks. They were gone, dead and gone. The sorrow was all-encompassing, too intense to bear for long. Adian could feel his body and mind shrink away from the emotion and instead push forward towards something more comfortable, more familiar, an emotion with at least the illusion of control. Blame tried to fuel anger within him, blame directed at himself for being too weak, blame towards Dre for trying to play the hero, but the true blame lay with Rucker. Before his flickering anger could turn into something altogether more terrible, the thought of Rucker brought a very pertinent question to mind. Adian pushed down his storm of emotions and grasped desperately at the distraction. "Put me down. I can stand," Adian said. Dre looked unsure, but he hesitantly followed the direction. Supporting his own weight brought another wave of pain down upon Adian, but he didn't regret the choice. If anything, he relished the distraction. "I remember now," he said, his voice low and gravelly. "But where is everyone else? After I made it up the incline, I don't remember seeing anyone else." "I don't know. I'm sorry, but I don't know. They're just gone. I've been moving fast, but I haven't even seen a glimpse of them. These tunnels wind and split so often that it isn't much of a surprise. There was a fork in the tunnel near the very beginning. For all I know, I just chose the wrong way, and now we could be on the opposite side of the dungeon from them," Dre said, the words catching in his throat. "It's okay, Dre. I'm sure that you've done everything that you could. Thank you for saving me. But now we need to find a place for you to rest and for me to heal," Adian replied in as soothing a tone as he could manage. Dre nodded and tried to pick Adian up, but he waved them away. Together, they moved quietly along the winding tunnel. In no time at all, Adian regretted turning down Dre's offer of assistance. He felt like nothing more than a fused conglomeration of wounds. Everything ached, and every movement, large or small, caused the never-ending pain to flare. By the Creator's mercy, it wasn't all that long before they happened across a promising peculiarity. A crack in the wall that was barely large enough for Dre to squeeze through led to a rocky alcove. The crack was along the very edge of the small space, and the chamber bent around so that the vast majority of it was completely out of view from the tunnel. Thankfully, a small patch of moss in the wall shared with the tunnel provided just enough light to barely see by. The niche wasn't much larger than the room that Adian was currently renting in the tavern, and its uneven rock walls and floor appeared far from comfortable. Even still, Adian couldn't help but to sigh in contented relief when Dre helped him to a sitting position. He started to turn his head in an attempt to see the damage to his shoulders and back, but searing pain stopped him almost immediately. "How bad is it?" Adian asked Dre, who had just taken off his pack and was slumped to the floor, back leaned against the wall as he tried to regain his breath. A few long moments passed before he replied, "You have some pretty nasty burns on your upper back and shoulders, and when I found you, you were curled around your marching drum. The explosion must have slammed you down on top of it. I wouldn't be surprised if you had some cracked ribs. I'm sure they are severely bruised at the very least. That and at least 100 other nicks and cuts." Adian gave a small nod and sighed. The pain in his back was so intense that he hadn't even noticed the ache in his ribs until Dre mentioned it. If only he had a healing potion. Wait. He should have a healing potion. He had ordered one, hadn't he? But he had never picked it up. It would have been ready, too, if he had just had the time to stop by the alchemists. He should have made the time. He should have known that a scouting mission with Rucker in charge was bound to end disastrously. He began to berate himself for his idiocy, but it didn't last very long. He just couldn't muster up the energy. Adian closed his eyes and lowered his head. Why was this happening? Why were his friends dead? Why had he gotten Dre trapped in this place of death? He wanted to scream and rage and cry, but he didn't. Instead, he slowly looked up towards the ceiling and prayed one questioning word in a soft, trembling voice. Why? It wasn't uttered in an accusatory way, simply in a desperate one. Had he strayed from the path the Creator had for him? Only hours before, after he had reconnected with his team and introduced them to Dre, he had been so sure that he was on the right track. But had he been mistaken? Had his own selfish desires to start an adventuring team and reconnect with his friends pushed him away from the Creator's will? Or were the terrible things that had happened, the wretched circumstances he found himself in, was it all just part of the Creator's plan? Over the course of history, far worse things had happened, and eventually been turned to good in the long run. Adian knew that might be the case, but such knowledge was empty, especially when compared to the sorrow that tried to tear him apart as he mourned the loss of his friends. He looked up and prayed two more earnest words. Help, please. Silence was the only response. He sighed and turned his attention towards Dre, who was sitting on the ground with his back leaned against the wall. His eyelids seemed made of stone from how much trouble he was having keeping them open. Adian wanted to let him rest. Creator knew that the boy deserved it, but the fiery wounds on his upper back needed tending. Are there any mundane medical supplies in that pack of yours? I can only assume that the healing potions were all used up after the initial battle. The potions are all gone, but now that you mention it, I think the captain mentioned that one of the chests contained medical supplies. Hopefully I didn't burn that one in the fire. Drake groaned softly as he slowly stood. He dragged his pack over to where Adian was sitting, reached inside and pulled out a small wooden chest banded with iron. He placed it on the ground beside Adian, sat down, and started pulling an assortment of ointments and bandages out of it and placing them in front of Adian. I'm so sorry, he whispered, shaking his head even as he continued to pull out supplies. I should have thought of this earlier. Adian tried to say something to appease him, but no words came out. After all the medical supplies were displayed before him, Adian grabbed a ceramic bottle with a crude image of flames etched into it and some white willow bark, a type of bark with strong analgesic properties that took effect when he chewed. He asked Dre to put the rest of the supplies away and then slowly chewed the bitter bark. He was glad from the distraction of its sharp taste. Silence filled the room as he chewed. What was there to say? If this was one of the stories of old, then this would be the part where he uttered a rousing speech that lit a fire in both their hearts. They would dash off into the dungeon tunnels, find the rest of the militia, defeat the dungeon-bound, and manage a daring escape. They would probably even find that his entire team was miraculously still alive somehow. Oh, how Adian wished he could hope for such things. But this wasn't one of the old stories. Do you need help with that? Adian jerked as the soft question startled him out of his reverie. He looked up to see Dre pointing to the ointment, his hand trembling slightly, his expression fallen. That would be much appreciated, Adian replied, his tone as soft as he could manage. He even attempted a small smile, but the action felt wrong and strained, as if his facial muscles had atrophied from disuse in only a few hours. Using a knife from his pack, Dre cut the shirt away from Adian's upper back. He was ever so gentle, but even so pain flared through the dulling effects of the willow bark as cloth was peeled away from seared flesh. He winced as Dre began to rub the cold ointment onto his fiery wounds. When he had grown accustomed to the discomfort, he began to sing softly, at a volume not much more than a whisper. He poured his pain and confusion into the song as he activated his healing song skill. He begged for answers to the same difficult questions that he had asked years previous when he had first written it. His voice cracked, and some of the words came out as sobs or pained gasps. But still, he sang. Why is there sin and death and pain? Why don't you take it all away? Why is the world a broken place? Why did you set things up this way? Why? Oh, why? As he sang the second verse, he dropped his voice an octave. It seemed silly to do so in his current predicament, but it was how he had written it to be sung. So he did it anyway, in an attempt to imitate the Creator's voice. Child, who condenses the clouds to make it rain. Child, who molded a man from dirt and clay. Child, who holds back his wrath with walls of grace. Child, who abandons the flock for lonely stray. It is I. Why do bad men live while good men die? Why does getting old mean turning gray? Why is there more suffering than joy? Why do fathers leave instead of stay? Why? Oh, why? Child, who pulls the sun across the sky. Child, who releases the wind to let it play. Child, who chose to create but could destroy. Child, who opens your eyes at start of day. It is I. Why am I so weak instead of strong? Why don't you answer my prayer on this day? Why won't you show your face if you are real? Why was I promised joy but feel dismay? Why? Oh, why? Child, when you are weak, you still belong. Child, just give me your hand, I'll show the way. Child, when it is time, I'll be revealed. Child, suffering's the price of life you pay. Child, you are my child. Adian didn't notice the tears streaming down his face until long after silence had crept back around him. He tried to stop them, but to no avail. They were not tears of pain. Between the salve, willow bark, and his healing song, he barely felt the pain at all. No, these were tears of sorrow, frustration, and confusion. Conditions that were not as simple to remedy as mere pain. He heard something beside him and slowly turned to see Dre, who was hunched over, with arms wrapped around his knees and cheeks visibly wet. How could something like this Dre started to ask, but Adian was distracted as his sense danger skill activated and flooded his body with a foreboding unease. He gestured for Dre to stop talking and closed his eyes. He strained his ears for long moments before he finally was able to pick up something out of the engulfing silence. He continued listening. Yes, there it was again. The sound of muffled steps, or perhaps the padding of paws. Dre shifted audibly, and Adian once again motioned for silence. Dre stopped, and the two of them stayed like that, still as gravestones. The sound of movement from the tunnels grew until it filled Adian's perception. When the sounds were terrifyingly close, multiple green glows flashed across the crack in the wall that led to the main tunnel. It was barely visible to them from where they were sitting, but that glow was unmistakable. It was the sickly illumination cast from corrupted eyes. Soon, the sounds faded into nothingness, but it was still countless heartbeats before either of them mustered the courage to move again. When they finally did, they shifted themselves and their gear so that it was even further out of sight from the tunnel. Then they just sat in the oppressive silence as Dre's partially asked question hung broken between them. The fire slowly returned to Adian's back and shoulders. Eventually, he was forced to sing under his breath while he activated his healing ability until the pain once again receded. While he was still singing, Dre drifted off into a well-deserved but restless sleep. Instead of waking him, Adian repeated his cycle of stillness and singing. Each time he was able to wait longer before the pain returned in force. By the time Dre woke up, the pain in his back was nothing but a dull ache. He had lost track of how long it had been since he had last needed to use his ability. Dre checked on his back and told him what he had already expected. While his back was still red and inflamed, most of the serious damage had been healed. He gingerly twisted his back and rolled his shoulders. He found the movements uncomfortable, but the pain was now manageable. The silence, however, was becoming unmanageable. Adian decided to say the obvious, before it became even more unbearable. We can't stay here. We have to find a way out. How? After hearing those creatures pass by as quickly as they did, I've started to think that we were incredibly lucky that I wasn't caught while you were unconscious. Adian nodded in agreement. Creatures passed by on 2 separate occasions while you were asleep. As for how, I have some ideas, but none are overly appealing. He had thought long and hard about their predicament while Dre had been asleep. Wandering at random trying to find the exit was much more likely to get them killed than allow them to escape. They could try and retrace their steps to where they had gotten separated from the militia, then follow their tracks out, or until they caught up with them. Of course, that assumed that the militia was currently in a better situation than they were in, which Adian seriously doubted, since such a large group would have a much harder time hiding. Either way, the idea would never work because neither of them had abilities or knowledge related to tracking. Maybe waiting for rescue was the only reasonable thing to do. If anyone had gotten out alive, they would surely bring back reinforcements, right? But how long could they wait? How long could they survive down here? Already his stomach was rumbling, and his throat was parched. Do you have any food rations? Any water? Adian asked, his thoughts spilling into words. Dre shook his head, but pulled out the butt end of a loaf of bread and half an empty canteen. Only what's left from what I threw in my pack before leaving my house this morning. Or yesterday, I guess. I can't believe it's only been that long. It feels like a lifetime since I've been home. Adian sighed. It was as he had feared. Rucker must have just loaded Dre up with useless weight. If they made it out of this mess, then he was going to kill that classless... Adian breathed deeply, and then sighed again. It wasn't worth the effort to think of Rucker. Not while they were trapped. He did, however, make a mental note that if they made it out, no, when they made it out, he was going to make sure that Dre was loaded down with enough food and water to sustain the population of all of Jezwahay through winter. That didn't matter right now, though. And besides, how long were they likely to last hidden like this, even if they had food? Honestly, Adian was amazed that they hadn't been sniffed out already. Dre was obviously thinking along similar lines because he asked, Do you think that the corruption or disease or whatever the animals have has dulled their senses? Adian thought about it for a moment, and then shrugged. I can't say for sure, but our ability to hide from them sure makes it seem that way. Dre nodded slowly. So, you previously mentioned that this dungeon most likely had a dungeon bound. What does that mean exactly? Does the dungeon bound control the creatures, and do you really think that it could be Dexter? I don't know what abilities dungeon bound actually have. I don't have any first-hand experience, and my studies focused on music, but I have heard rumors. Some say that they can sense the location of every being in their dungeon, which again seems unlikely on account of us not being dead. I've also heard of them using the senses of their creatures as extensions of their own, which might make more sense in our scenario. It's hard to know what is true, though. The stories vary so wildly. For every tale that describes dungeon-bound as awesome and terrible monsters, there's another that describes them as decrepit things that are essentially just fuel, like logs in a bonfire. The dungeon burns through their life force to empower itself until there is no life left. I wish I knew what was true. Maybe all of them are. Maybe none of them. Gideon paused and shifted slightly to ease some of the pain that still lingered. As for whether or not the dungeon bound is Dexter, I have no idea. But at this stage, I don't have a better suspect. Can you think of anything about him that might help us predict what he would do? If he is the dungeon bound, that is? Gideon waited as Dre stared at some loose dirt that he was rubbing between his fingers. After many long moments, he said, I don't really know. Like I told you earlier, I saw him torturing animals, and this dungeon seems to contain a lot of corrupted animals, so that might indicate that it's him, but doesn't give us any new information. He had a notoriously short attention span when he was little. Couldn't keep his mind on one task for long, except maybe for, the animal torturing. But I don't think that really helps either. Dre gave a helpless shrug. Gideon looked away and tried not to let his annoyance and frustration show on his face. As it often happened while he was stuck in this literal crack in the wall, he found his gaze attracted to the only source of illumination in the room, the small glowing patch of moss on the wall. I've seen this type of moss before, Dre said, breaking the silence as he apparently stared at the moss as well. My brother took me out into the woods a few years back. We found a cave that was just filled with this stuff. Javan got all excited about it, said that he'd heard about this kind of moss but had never seen it. He told me that its proper name is schistostega, or something like that, but most folks know it as dragon's gold. Quite the epic name for a little plant that just so happens to glow, if you ask me. We almost got lost in that little cave system, but... Dre paused, and a look of excitement bloomed on his face. He nodded a few times and then stood up. Where are you going? Gideon asked. We need to travel up. Up has to be out. I didn't think of it before, but this isn't just a cave system in a mountain. This is a tunnel system, with the exit being located at the top. That is how Javan and I found our way out of that cave. We just traveled up. I'm guessing that when we were teleported, Dre paused and looked at Gideon, seeming to want confirmation of the fantastical statement. Gideon gave an affirming nod, which Dre returned as he began speaking again. I thought that must have been the case, but I thought teleporting would feel different. More magical, maybe? But anyways, it seems logical that we would have been teleported to the farthest point from the entrance. Since the entrance was at a relatively high point compared to the nearby terrain, the farthest point is also the lowest one. So if we consistently travel up, then eventually we will reach the exit. As to how we are supposed to avoid the corrupted creatures, I have absolutely no idea. Dre started to quickly and quietly put things back in his pack, his idea obviously spurring him into action. Gideon, on the other hand, sat and thought. There had to be something that they could do to at least help their chances of survival, but what was it? He prayed and racked his brain, and just as he was about to give up hope, something came to him. It wasn't a great idea, but it was an idea. Dre, do you have anything in your pack that rolls? With a little more discussion on the topic, the plan was set. Gideon stood up and only winced slightly. The pain in his back had faded to that of a bad sunburn, which was a marked improvement over the previous level of intensity, which had felt like getting repeatedly stabbed in the back with a knife. After getting themselves prepped to go, they once again sat down where they could not be seen from the crack in the wall. Their positions were almost identical to when they had first entered the room, but where they had previously slumped in exhaustion, pain, and defeat, they now crouched with bated breath and eager anticipation. An indiscernible amount of time later, Gideon felt the prick of his danger sense. After a few moments, he once again heard the padding of many feet in the tunnel outside. The two of them held still as statues. The only movement they risked was breathing, and that only occurred when the lack of air broke their attention away from their avid listening. Long after the sounds had faded into memory, Aiden crept up to Dre and whispered, "They came from the same direction as previously, and as far as I could tell, the group seems to be of a similar size as well. I think that we were correct in assuming that it's a recurring patrol." Dre smiled, but the expression quickly shifted into an uncertain grimace. "I guess all that is left is for us to head out then," he whispered. Adian gave a curt nod in reply and crept towards the opening. He listened for a few heartbeats and heard exactly what he was hoping for. Absolutely nothing. So he slid smoothly through the crack, waited for Dre and his pack to squeeze out, turned uphill, and began to run.